fundamentally, the need for more energy that's clean and affordable, that dual challenge of we need more energy, yes, and we need it to be more affordable, that is a hard problem. But I think that dual mandate, especially when it comes to voters, they're going to care about how much they're paying. Who pays? That's a kind of a story thread that I'll be covering in the future.
Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am Richard Delavan, speaking to you on the 3rd of June, 2025. You just heard there from Kat Clifford, senior reporter at Cipher, and we had a fabulous conversation coming up that we recorded last week. But first, if you're seeing this on video and look a bit awkward, in part because it's a blustery day here in England, as Winnie the Pooh might have observed in the 100-Acre Wood, the real version of which is about 20 minutes drive from here. So playing the part of an anxious piglet to my Pooh is Poppy, our reasonably young Sprocker puppy, who decided that she's afraid of the wind, aren't you? And insists on sharing my chair. She wants to get on the action. So when I spoke to Kat last week, she broke some news about something that was happening in the Texas legislature, story I've been tracking but hadn't heard this bit yet. They'd been threatening to destroy the booming renewables business that had been hammering up so much battery, solar, and wind that it was driving down electricity costs, and in fact, the only way to keep the lights on as demand grows. The House failed to take up a lot of these bills that the Senate, we'll get on all the details, but it looked like that was all over. Yay, good guys win. A rare win in 2025. Not so fast. Texas watchers like Doug Lewin said, because in Texas, there has been form on sneaking in some Franken bills, stitching the bill that had died onto a bill that was likely to pass in the last minutes in order to be able to kind of sneak some stuff through. And at the end of the session was yesterday, June 2nd. Bum, bum, bum. That looks like you can chalk one up for the good guys. As according to the reporting I'm seeing this morning, the session ended with almost all of those bills passing away peacefully in the night. Why am I banging on about Texas? Well, let's just think about what nearly happened there. So there was SB 388. Now, what percentage of new generation in the queue in Texas do you think was natural gas? Not very much. Vast majority, solar and battery. Why? Cheap, works, it's just happening. This bill would have required 50% of new generation to come from natural gas, or else make renewable companies pay out subsidies to natural gas companies. Dead. SB 819. Take Texas' previously light touch regulation on permitting and just for solar, wind, and battery, load it up with a bunch of red tape to slow it down. Dead. SB 715. Force wind and solar developers already on sites that are already up and running, maybe for years, to pay fees to firm their power. In other words, when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, that if they don't install a bunch of battery packs or find some other way to generate electricity when, on the off hours, then they would be required to pay fees to others that would make them uneconomic and basically shut down a lot of that capacity, which was the point. Dead. SB 383, which would effectively kill any offshore wind in the Gulf of Mexico by making it illegal for it to have transmission lines through Texas state waters that would be needed to connect the Texas grid up. Dead. Now, if these had gone through, snuck into law in the dead of night, the consequences for people who went to Texas because it was considered a vibrant, dynamic, free-flowing market, that needs a lot of energy. People like Q from Modo we've had on, and folks from Octopus Energy we had on, or tons of others. They'd be having a not great day today, and instead the fossil fuel Texas Taliban has a black eye as prominent as Elon Musk's. Because, as Kat and I talk about, most people, and especially businesses, just want power that's affordable and reliable and clean. And renewables, almost entirely due to market forces, were delivering that in Texas. Only some really irrational shit could derail that. And it nearly did. So, no one needs to rest on their laurels. This is a small draw in a larger landscape of lots of things that are headed in the wrong direction. But we're going to keep on top of it. And if you're enjoying these conversations and little jaunts and rants occasionally and random stuff from dogs, thank you. for being here. And if you do enjoy them, we'd appreciate it. We'd love it if you could share this conversation with someone you think might get some benefit from it. And you can hit those 5 stars on Apple or Spotify to let people find the show, and share it on social networks like Blue Sky, maybe not the other ones, maybe LinkedIn, but or you could become a member at wickedproblems.earth, and together we might just get through this. Now here's my conversation with Kat. Enjoy. We're joined by Kat Clifford, senior reporter at Cipher News, whose recent reporting has tracked a surging new force reshaping U.S. energy politics: artificial intelligence. AI's demand for electricity is ballooning. Data centers are now driving a tectonic shift in how and how fast America needs to build out new energy capacity. But as Kat's stories for Cipher reveal, the policy response is a mess of contradictions. Trump-era support for nuclear and geothermal to tariffs that hurt renewables more than fossil fuels to a Department of Energy being quietly hollowed out. What happens when the infrastructure needed to power the future is kneecapped by the politics of the present? Kat Clifford, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
It's our privilege. So we're excited to have you on, and we'll make sure that people can find all the pieces we're going to talk about from your reporting, and where they can follow you on Blue Sky. So look, I mean, we wanted to talk about AI because it's just such a dominant thing, and you've been writing about this. And one of the pieces you wrote starts with the paradox: AI might help cut emissions, but only if we power it cleanly. And what drew you to this? What made you decide like this is the story you really wanted to report out?
Yeah, thank you for starting the great introduction and starting there. That was a story I wrote back in March of last year at CERAWeek, which is sort of this big confab in Texas. And I was reporting from Houston. One of the things I noticed before going to the conference, looking through the huge booklet of there's so many panels. I mean, it's like trying to plot your course there. And there were so many panels and conversations about AI at that CERAWeek last year. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was sort of one of the, I think, moments that I really started to focus my reporting on AI, and among other issues, right? But I think one of the things that's really interesting about AI from a climate perspective is that it's not a simple story, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's not a black or white. It's not necessarily all good or, all bad. There's a lot of reasons why using artificial intelligence to address climate issues, to find efficiencies, to is really beneficial. A few examples, you know, there's a lot of mitigation efforts also that use AI. So for
Mm-hmm.
example, flood forecasting, wildfire tracking, these are really valuable mitigation techniques. There's also, for example, using AI to help airlines replot their flights to avoid some of the contrails.
Or as RFK Jr. would say, chemtrails. So
Yeah,
we don't need to go there. That's all right.
right. But at the same time, so there are these real world benefits of using AI to, both mitigation and adaptation climate efforts. And also it is going to take a huge amount of energy, right? The amount of energy that is going to be needed to drive artificial intelligence and data centers is massive. The backdrop that's really important to put that in context is, we're already seeing a rise in electricity demand, a rise in energy demand. So the energy demand that's expected to come from AI comes against a backdrop of already increasing energy demand. So that just makes it extra acute. And so that conflict is really interesting. And I really do think that it was the how Sarah week last year. So not the one 20 I wasn't actually at this one this year, but 2024, that really
Mm-hmm.
was that sort of a defining felt like everyone at that conference was talking about AI.
Absolutely. And again, it was a huge topic, and it's something that I think a lot of the utilities who were also speaking there were talking about the fact that like that's why we're going to need to put more gas cycle blah 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 stuff generation, because it's we're never no other way we're going to be able to do it. But what was most surprising for you as somebody who's observed the energy market, the climate space for years, about this kind of logarithmic kind of increase of projected electricity demand from data centers, particularly, or I was talking to someone the other day, refer to them as AI factories now, because as a way of distinguishing like the category difference of like what AI is doing previously data centers were like really tame kind of tenants on a grid, and like they had a very like stable load, demand, and like basically like, but now it's stochastic, right? Like basically when they do training, it goes from da ba da, and in
Yep.
like places like Northern Virginia or parts of Texas or parts of Northern California, where it's like upwards of 20% of demand, you like, and then but also can spike up or down 5-10% over the course of a couple of an hour, which could trip, like could cause a blackout basically, because like the complete change of demand profile. What was surprising to you about that? Like again, the scale of the change.
So I think the two things that were really interesting. Number one is that there's actually a lot that's unknown about this right now. I mean,
Mhm.
we don't we know that the energy demand from AI is going to be large. It's going to be significant. Just how large and just how significant, I do think is actually still a pretty it was then when I started doing this reporting back at CERAWeek last year,
Mhm.
but even still now, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about just how much energy it is, AI is going to take. How, first of all, how widely is it going to be adopted? How much is it going to be used? How efficient are the different inferences and processes? So I think that we know it's gonna be a lot of energy, but it is sort of also the fact that we don't know exactly how much, and that's sort of an open question. So, not only is it complicated, right, because it's not a black or white, there's good and bad, but it also is an evolving question that we still are getting our hands around. But I remember to an executive of an energy company that's for that story, and he made a point that I thought was really valuable that are we gonna put the genie back in the bottle? Probably not. And kind of what I think, is sort of the idea there is that not only is this not a black or white question, not only
Mhm.
is it an evolving question with a lot of uncertainties, but it's also something of like an inevitability, right? I think the idea of, that we're going to somehow stop using AI, or that we're going to restrict our use of AI on a national or global basis is like unrealistic.
Right.
So you have this new force that we kind of have to deal with. And so I think that was something that makes the story, really compelling.
Absolutely. I mean, it's transformative. At the moment, it's actually quite a small percentage, right,
Right.
globally. Some places like Northern Virginia, it's actually like it's completely outsized. But places that are, globally, it's still pretty small compared to like industrial like electrification of factories and whatever. And, kind of EVs are up there, and, other things are, loads on the grid. But I do think that like, people do seem to have come around to the fact that after 20 years of static, kind of demand,
Yes.
the industry has had to completely change its mindset about what it means to actually serve the demand that's coming up. One of the ways that people have talked about that is nuclear. And one of your most viral headlines, you described, big tech entering a bromance with nuclear. What's that about?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That was a tagline from another podcast I did with Hannah Ritchie, Our World and Data editor, who I think very highly of. And I described the nuclear data center pair up as a bromance. And so I think, well, I did say that we don't know exactly how much energy AI is gonna take, but there are some estimates, and I think it's worth calling out one of these estimates just so we have a sense of what we're talking about here. So, even though there are uncertainties, and I think that's a legitimate point, I think there are also some estimates that put some of this growth in perspective, right? So, because it is changing the game. I just wanna call out this report that I wrote about from Grid Strategies, which is this DC based electric consulting firm, and they do really, really good work. In January, tally a bunch of projections from utilities, and they they were looking at the growth over the next 5 years. So the growth that utilities are projecting over the next 5 years, um, and this is a little complicated. Bear with me on the numbers, but the growth that utilities are projecting for the next 5 years went from 23 gigawatts to over 128 gigawatts in 2 years. These are massive projections, right? Like if you're talking about expecting to grow, needing to add 23 gigawatts to the grid, and then you're talking about expecting to grow, need to add 128 gigawatts to the grid over the next 5 years. I just want to put some numbers on there. Even though there are uncertainties and we don't know all of it, there are projections and utilities are looking at a completely new landscape.
Right.
So, and okay, so to bring the nuclear bromance point in here, I mean, one of the values that AI data centers look for is always on energy, right? They want their data centers operating 100% of the time, ideally. And nuclear is a always on, slowed, clean source of energy. And the other thing that you can think about with nuclear reactors, not only some of the new designs for smaller nuclear reactors, is that you could potentially co locate them with data centers. So you have 24/7 baseload power from nuclear reactors. You have clean energy, which a lot of these hyperscaler tech companies that are getting into AI, they do have an interest in their sustainability messaging. I think there is a conflict arising now, which maybe we'll get into later in this conversation. But generally speaking, it's going to be their priority. They would prefer to be powering this with clean energy from a public perception. You know, oh, I don't hear you.
Here I was trying to be, disciplined and have my mute on, like old guy mute button, like
No,
Zoom
everybody
call,
does it. Everybody.
COVID era. There you go. I was just going to say, I think it's probably worth noting, like, yeah, I mean, to your point, that like that sector, for all the stick it's currently taking because it's changing its, kind of some of them are changing their promises about when they'll be kind of net zero or carbon neutral or whatever, and they've had to revise their estimates, and some of them have been fairly some have been better than others, I'll just say, in terms of like how transparent they've been about that change.
Yeah,
The reality is that the situation has changed, right? It would be remiss for us not to mention the fact that part of the reason the solar cost curve got crushed by 90% or the battery cost curve got crushed by 75% in recent years is partly because of the PPAs that these big tech companies took out in order to be able to, like, get 24/7 carbon-free electricity, and in like the case of Google, get really smart about shifting compute load around the world to chase the green electron, which is, again, I think that it's important not to lose sight of the fact that a lot of the advances that have been made would not have happened had they not been some of the biggest purchasers of this
abso-
stuff.
absolutely. And
Sorry,
that
I just thought I'd bring it up.
And I think that it's a perfect segue to sort of the other reason that sort of I describe this as a bromance is
Mm,
not only does nuclear supply what the data center providers need, the clean baseload always on power that, potentially with some of these new designs, you could be co-locating with the data center, some of the smaller micro reactors. We'll see
mhm,
how all that develops. But the other thing is that it's a bromance because it works both ways, right? I mean, nuclear and I have written a lot of, I've done a lot of reporting about the nuclear industry. It is clean, but baseload power is expensive.
mhm,
And it currently is very expensive and slow to build. And one of the things that these tech companies who have a major incentive to develop their AI business, and they also have an interest in developing their clean, sustainable profile, is they also have a lot of money, and
yeah,
so they can provide the kind of financing that the nuclear industry really needs right now. Now, I don't think the tech industry on its own is going to support a complete rebirth of the nuclear industry, but it is a significant and real partnership. So,
mhm,
I do think that there's a lot of reasons. And, there's a lot of examples of sort of deals that have been signed. Google with Kairos Power, Amazon announced it's looking to get into SMRs.
yeah,
Meta said it was looking for developers. Just recently, this was in May, Google also said it was collaborating with a nuclear project developer called Elemental to sort of help them provide early stage capital for some of the site development work, which is also really important. That's the kind of so, I do think that there is some real benefit to that bromance.
right. Because I mean, it is something that I suppose one of my big kind of slight hits around, particularly SMRs, is the idea that we haven't. None exist in the wild, right? Allegedly, there's one in Russia. Allegedly, there's one in China. No one's been able to actually see them, so who knows? But I do see, like, it was only what, a week ago thereabouts that the first permit for an SMR design was issued by the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I want to say the
Okay,
Tennessee Valley Authority. There was something new and first, right, about the TVA's plan for this thing at Clinch River.
okay, the TVA, that is new, and I do note that. So the TVA, that's the Tennessee Valley
Yeah.
Authority, and they put in their application for that's the first time a utility, and that's
Ah, okay.
okay, so that's really interesting and also indicates a shift in this market, that it's the
Mm,
first time that a utility a TVA
yeah.
is interesting, it's a publicly owned utility, not
Mm,
that a utility is looking to build an SMR,
yeah.
and that's notable because typically a utility isn't gonna take on a nuclear construction right now because it's
Mm.
always expensive.
Yeah. I mean, I'm here in the UK and like Sizewell C and various other projects here. Like we have, I mean, yeah, we could spend all day talking about that. But there was another technology that, again, I think like we were hoping, I was hoping anyway, when Chris Wright was named as Energy Sec, that we would be seeing a lot more about.
Mhm,
Um, and your reporting on this is interesting as well. So I think you're hearing some different things. You have much better sourcing than I do. I'm over here. When I watched Chris Wright's confirmation hearings, I
mhm,
saw Mike Lee from Utah both kind of waxing rhapsodical about for advanced geothermal
mhm.
and the idea that you can use, or rather repurpose, fracking technology without the nasties pumping water into the ground to actually get to different hot rocks than you could otherwise get to. You could then use that to drive a generator, drive a turbine, and then generate electricity pretty much, free, clean, forever, at least in human timescales. So, what is the state of play and what's your reporting about? Like, I hear different things about what's happening with the administration and with whether or not this is real or whether or not DOE is actually going to just completely crap on all of this stuff, including geothermal. So, what's true?
Well, I've done a lot more reporting on the nuclear space than I have on
Sure.
geothermal, and I recently did a story, though absolutely you rightly point out for Cipher on geothermal. It was some of the first deep, reporting I've done on geothermal. I was really interested. It's really fascinating, and I'm really curious about this space, and I would like to do a lot more reporting. But the headline for that story was that, Chris Wright is definitely enthusiastically, vocally supportive
He's a fanboy.
of geothermal.
Yeah.
And I think not only is he saying that, but also in his previous position, he was the CEO of Liberty Energy, which and when he was running Liberty Energy, they made an investment in Fervo Energy. So, there's a track record there. But I think the reality is that we don't
Mm.
really know yet what's the future of geothermal is going to be because while there's been support and public support from Chris Wright and, it geothermal definitely meets the energy dominance and national energy
Okay.
dominance and energy independence. Those are the 2 kind of main themes, and geothermal, unlike geothermal comes from under our feet, right? So there's sort of that we don't need to depend on, you know, bringing technology or
Yeah.
building other technologies like solar and wind, that it's a source that we can tap at our feet, and I think that's very attractive current administration. How geothermal is still a pretty nascent industry in this
Hmm.
country and
Hmm.
globally. I think I had a stat pulled up here from the IEA. Currently, geothermal meets 1% of energy demand. However,
Right.
there's a lot of potential, but in order for the United States and globally for that
Hmm.
potential to be met, there's going to need to be a lot of investment.
Right.
And we're gonna have to do you talked about driving down the cost curve of solar and batteries. We need to drive down the cost curve of geothermal. There needs to be a lot of investment in this kind of what they call first of a kind financing.
Do you say FOAC or folk? You ask
I
people.
say folk, but I don't
Right.
know really. I say folk, but I could be mispronouncing it. What do you say?
I prefer FOAC, but that's just
What?
me. Folk just sounds too much like folks,
Yeah,
and FOAC just sounds a little more, I don't know, sci-fi something. I don't know.
yeah,
Anyway, just
yeah,
random stuff. But look, I mean, and again, it is interesting, right? Whether it got support. I think the
right,
expectation, tell me
right,
if I'm wrong, but coming in, right, because like Mike Lee, seriously conservative Republican in Utah, this is a bipartisan, non-coded energy technology, right? Which was like, there's nobody who doesn't like this.
right.
Everyone likes this. It could employ lots and lots of people who otherwise in oil and gas would be out of a job, if the transition, moved swiftly, right? If, as far as I'm concerned, if the US is going to like bail on this stuff, Tim Latimer from Fervo, if you're listening, come here to the UK. I can introduce you to the right people. Come on over.
There you go, there you go. And whether or not that financing for first of a kind financing whether that money for first of a kind financing, whether the
Hmm.
tax credits, which is
Yeah.
currently at this moment being debated, the House bill that passed last week is going to decrease
Mm.
the tax credits available for geothermal. There were some nice carve outs for nuclear, but geothermal did not get the same benefits. And if there's not gonna if you're gonna talk about being pro geothermal, but not provide the financing that the industry really needs right now to get off the ground, then I think, there's a bit of a conflict there. But I do just wanna say, potential is pretty impressive. I mean,
Mm.
there was a report from the IEA, International Energy Agency,
Mhm.
earlier this year. I think it was earlier this year, and they predict the cost of geothermal could plummet by 80% by 2035. That's massive. So
Mm.
the technology that has a lot of potential for the cost curve to get driven down, and also connecting to our previous conversation about where we sort of started on AI. There's also a lot of potential for geothermal to meet AI data center demand. And that was also something I included in my report in terms of the potential for geothermal. Not only is there the potential for the cost to come down significantly,
Mhm.
but then also in terms of meeting demand for AI, Ben King, who is an incredible energy analyst at Rhodium Group, he put out a report in March that, if we were to continue to bring down the cost curve, you could
Mm.
and economically meet two-thirds of power demand from data centers by early 2030 if we developed the data centers in regional clusters. So there's some ifs there, right? But that's
Mm.
huge. I
Mm.
do think that there is the potential for geothermal to be this huge resource that meets so many of what the administration's agenda are, and also would help meet our this AI demand, which is also a major focus of the agenda. But whether or not the financing is going to come through, that's yet to be seen. I do think that the
Right.
Senate, which is supposed to take up the House bill, is going to change. There's a lot of thinking that they're going to edit the tax credits
Mhm.
that were slashed in the House bill. So we'll see,
Mm.
right? But a lot of that's in question right now.
I know that Lisa Murkowski was the lead author on a letter to Senate Majority Leader John Thune, suggesting that the tax credits needed to be protected because across various technology stacks. So we will see what happens. I would have to say, if I was a Republican in a marginal district which went for Biden in 24, and I walked the plank to vote for this thing, which now everyone is running wants to run away from, I probably wouldn't be too pleased. But anyway, this is not a political show. We won't spend too much time on that. But look, we're actually on politics. We have to talk about
Yeah.
one thing. Over the last couple of months, lots changed.
Yeah.
We had tariffs, we had no tariffs, we had tariffs, no tariffs, tariffs, no tariffs. And the court in the US yesterday seemed to say, as some people said from the beginning, the president actually doesn't have the power to do that with
Right.
tariffs, which has had a huge disruption to the investment climate, confidence in doing much of anything involving any kind of supply chains that would be imported stuff. One of the areas that seemed likely to be hit hardest,
Yeah.
not just renewables, but actually a lot of elements within the kind of AI ecosystem. From your reporting, from your sources, are people just like, are their heads just completely melted at this point from having to keep track of, like, should I just bother to come into work tomorrow? Because I don't know what's happening. It
Well,
just is maddening.
yeah, I do think there is a lot of uncertainty, and I attended a Bloomberg NEF conference about a month ago. Even at that time, my sort of takeaway from that was uncertainty was the word of the conference. There's so much uncertainty, and that is, tariffs, tax credits, investment policy, economy, a huge, um, that is a huge thing to deal with, right?
Mhm.
As you said, the tariff situation specifically, which is in flux, as you also said, but the
Mhm.
tariffs will likely hit renewables like wind and solar a lot harder than fossil sources of energy because we import a lot of the components for solar in particular, whereas fossil comes domestically. But I do think it's also maybe a good time to mention a conversation I had with Neil Chatterjee. He was one of the former FERC regulators in President Trump's first term. And I think one of the points that he was making, and which I reported in a story I wrote for Cipher, and kind of pertains to um, how we're going to meet this moment for AI.
Hmm.
If we're really genuinely in an AI race and we are gonna make that a priority, the only way we're gonna meet demand near term, which we sort of talked about in the nuclear bromance conversation earlier, that's gonna take time.
Hmm.
Thermal's gonna take time. All these things. If we're the and also natural gas peaker turbines, there's such a backlog in natural
Mm,
gas turbines right now
totally.
that even though, that was sort of, I think, a knee-jerk response, like, "Okay, we'll meet this demand with natural gas." Well, it's gonna take you like, the timelines for getting natural gas online right now are, 2030. So, realistically, only way to, meet this demand right now is solar plus battery storage, and Neil would say with, gas peaker plants for storage, and
Mm,
that if we're gonna sort of need to meet that demand in this political moment, that there's gonna have to be some compromising from both sides.
mm,
That we're both gonna need to use some fossil generation, maybe keep fossil generation online for a little bit longer than we would have wanted, or also maybe use it, as a sort of a backup, solar plus storage plus peakers is, and then on the right, the political right, there's kind of like, if you wanna win this AI race, right now, the most realistic and likely and really the only possible way we're gonna do that, get the energy to win the AI race in the near term, is with solar. And so I think
mm,
with solar and storage, if we're gonna come together on that point, we're gonna have to make some compromises. There is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lot of challenges in meeting this demand. If we're going to be competitive in the AI race, I think there's gonna have to be some compromises from both sides. Will that
mm.
happen? Again, maybe yet to be seen, but I think it's a valuable point.
100%. And I do think, yeah, it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. Next week in Texas, we're going to find out whether or not the Texas state ledge is going to like cut its own throat to decide whether or not to dissuade AI hyperscalers from coming there because they're going to mess up their electricity market.
Yeah, I literally just read it on the Hill. I haven't done my own confirmation of this yet, but a number of bills that were gonna hurt the Texas renewable
Yeah.
industry, they missed a key deadline in the state house.
Oh.
So, I just read this morning that
Oh.
those, this was in the Hill, that the state of the bills targeting the renewable industry are, missed a key deadline in the state house. Now that's, I haven't confirmed that independently, but that is sort of an interesting,
Wow.
iterative development, because Texas is kind of becoming a bellwether, or maybe you could say
Totally.
a microcosm for the larger conversation
Mm.
here. And yes, exactly what you were just bringing up, that they are trying to both win the AI race, and also they were had all these pieces of state legislature that were going to undermine the renewable development. And so if this is true, and I really always put an asterisk on things I haven't reported
Sure.
about myself, is that, that maybe that's an indication that, so
Well, I mean, I'm furiously using the Bodleian Library as we speak to research this as we're talking because
yeah,
that's encouraging, if true.
yeah,
So we will see. I see that Doug Lewin, who is kind of my go-to Texas analyst on this stuff, hasn't posted just yet on that, nor the Houston Crons. But look, I mean, if someone has magically found a way to bring sanity to the Texas Ledge, then we're all going to be better off for that.
yeah.
So fingers crossed. Like, there you go. You heard it here first, guys. You heard it here first from Cat Clifford from
Well,
Cipher.
it's
It's
official
not your report.
report.
I get it. Like, this is 2025. Come on.
Yeah,
But look, I mean, what are the other aspects of this? Which affects the entire kind of energy system in the United States is the grid, right? And that used to be
yeah,
that you was a even in Project 2025, the
yeah,
Heritage Foundation's kind of blueprint for the administration.
yeah.
Grid enhancement was meant to be an anchor for the strategy. It doesn't really feel like we're seeing that coalesce. Like your reporting indicates, like that there's just, like this is one of the areas where, as effective as they've been at doing other things, as it turns out, this is really hard.
Transmission is really hard, and, I think everybody wants, well, that's not true. Obviously, if everybody wanted it, it wouldn't be so hard. But
Right.
there are key,
Everybody wants it to be there, but they don't want to be on their land or to
exactly.
have to actually compromise their own particular regulatory framework.
Exactly. And so I think there is, this was sort of another area that I talked about with Neil Chatterjee, and I think he made a good point here, that in order for the country to meet its energy demands to win the AI race, it will need permitting.
Hmm.
reform, and
Yeah.
that will benefit both transmission and also pipelines, natural gas pipelines. And so again, that's going to mean a bit of compromise from both sides because, transmission in particular, I mean, you need transmission to get all kinds of generation, but in particular, transmission benefits renewables, right? Because you're going from places where there hasn't been sources of energy before. So then you're going to places where there's lots of wind and solar and bringing it. So transmission really is hugely important to bring utility scale solar to the grid. Pipelines, if you're going to build, that's the same thing. I mean, it's not exactly the same thing, but building pipelines means building things across borders. And that has historically been very hard. And whether and how we as a country become better at building transmission is massively important. And
Hmm.
I mean,
Well, it was the SunZia project, right? Like that's been like, on the shelf for 15
yeah, I
years
was
to
gonna say
bring
17 without looking it up. Yes,
17.
something like
Yeah.
that.
And it was like
Forever.
bringing like solar and wind from Utah and whatever from like to Southern Cal or
Yes,
Northern Cal, can't remember. But the point, be like it was stuck in permitting for 17 years, to your
yes,
point,
yeah.
which is just mental.
But a sort of implication of this, as it pertains to AI and data centers,
Mm,
is that there may be more interest in co-locating.
right.
So bringing power sources behind the meter, not just for AI and data centers, by the way, for
Sure.
many and kind of other industrial purposes, but not as this idea of co-locating
Yeah.
generation with demand
Yeah.
it is really going to become even more important as everyone sort of realizes that building transmission is like hard, really
Mm.
hard. The
I,
regulation connected with co-location is challenging.
Well,
So
the water issues seem like the most challenging in the sense that, the places you're going to get the most sun are also the ones that are most water stressed and are the ones that are going to actually, if you're competing for what little fresh water remains in the aquifer
right,
for residents and whatever, like that's because data centers, they require a lot of water
yeah.
to keep cool, right?
I would expect there would be a lot of innovation trying to drive down the water use of AI data centers because the data centers are important. And you're right, the water issues are important. I think there's also going to be a lot of conversation about how to regulate behind the meter power. I think that's going to be increasingly important going forward.
We've had a great conversation so far. I'd love to bring you back and talk about some more of the things. We're now above 40 minutes, and you've been so generous with your time. We're headed into next year, supposed to be elections. I
Yeah,
guess we'll see what happens.
be a
Um,
big election. Gonna be
I
big.
mean,
Yeah,
yeah, well, I mean, like again, I slightly get nervous, and I don't want to sound like a tinfoil hat guy, but like it does feel sometimes like these people are operating in such a way that they don't think they're ever going to have to actually
right.
face electoral
Yeah,
consequences, which
yeah,
makes me slightly nervous. What are you looking for? Like early signs? Like here we are in May of 2025. We're a long ways away
yeah.
from November 2026 for midterms. Obviously, there are a couple of state races coming up this year, and there'll be specials and whatever else. But the Senate is where a lot of this stuff is going to get debated over the next couple of weeks. What are you looking for? Who are you watching, and what signs are you looking for to get to see, to give you a hint about what way they might jump, whether they try to preserve some of the bipartisan infrastructure stuff, the CHIPS Act, the IRA, or whether or not they just roll in the way that like people legislatures have done so far for this new administration.
If I knew the answer to that, like if I knew what the Senate was going to do,
I know, but what are you watching? Where are you going to be keeping an eye
uh,
on?
I really wonder what's happening in behind those closed doors in those all-night meetings that they're having discussing these issues. It
And the guy,
really
and the guy who was both very tired and drunk in the cloakroom and didn't make the vote, the Republican congressman. I love that. I love the fact that it kind of humanizes them, really.
yeah,
Basically, this is so messed up that I'm up all night and I've just drank a fifth of whiskey and basically I'm asleep in the cloakroom. And like, if they need to wake me up to have to vote, fine. But otherwise, I'm just going to go sleep. I
to
just
be
love that.
honest, I didn't know that story, so you're telling me that, but yeah, I mean, the fact that they were debating it all night the night before it passed, I mean, I mean, I don't know. The jobs that are depend on a lot of these IRA tax credits are a really big factor for a lot of these constituents who have to go back
Mm,
home. The other factor that I would say that I think is gonna be as big a factor when it comes to, like, elections, um, the AI data centers, those matter for national competition. and they are very important. I really believe that it is important for AI, the AI race, for our national competitiveness, for the globe. But when it comes to elections locally, I think affordability of energy is gonna be a huge issue and maybe sort of a determining factor in terms of how people vote, and also will maybe, hopefully, impact how legislators vote, right?
Right.
Because another component of the IRA and the tax credits and a lot of these efforts is that they really are going to bring down the cost of electricity. And so I think, you know, affordability, how much it's gonna cost the ratepayers, how much
Hmm.
we're all gonna be paying for energy, I think that is something that Americans have very little tolerance for. And, I think the promise to bring grocery prices down was a massive bit of, political stumping, and
Hmm.
that was a big, focus. And so I think as it pertains to this conversation about energy and AI, I think ratepayers and mom and pop stores, if their energy prices start going through the roof, um, that is not going to get constituents elected. And so I would
Right.
hope that the affordability of energy over the long haul is part of what makes that decision. And I really do think that fundamentally that the need for more energy and
Hmm.
more energy that's clean and affordable. I mean,
Right.
I think that dual challenge of we need more energy, yes, and we need it to be more affordable, that is a hard problem, but I think that dual mandate, especially when it comes to voters, they're gonna care about how much they're
Mm.
paying. Who pays? That's a kind of a story thread that I'll be covering in the future, is who's gonna pay
Mm.
for this energy and the upgrades to the system, and how's the cost gonna get distributed? Those are all questions that are gonna matter a lot when it comes to who's gonna get elected.
Right. And final extra question, Kat Clifford, senior
Yeah.
reporter for Cipher. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. But like your stories, I think we're all living through this moment of, saying earlier on a different conversation that, like the Chinese curse made you live in an interesting time. Feels like here we are. Great. So, what is the thing that you mentioned about who pays for what? But other than that, is there a story that you're covering now which you never imagined a year ago would be on your radar? And what is it?
That I never imagined would be on my radar.
Or at least a year ago?
Yeah. Well, I think what I can say to that is that I'm doing I really come from, and my focus and the way I came into climate reporting was through writing about climate innovation, climate tech, climate science, and so my background is more in the hard science, the tech, the innovation, and in the last 6 months, 6 months, 5 months, 6 months, 5 months, whatever, pretty much I've been writing a lot about policy, and I
Mm,
think that's partly because we're a small team at Cipher, and when the new administration came in and started changing the landscape really significantly for the energy and climate policy, everyone was sort of all hands on deck, but I don't know that I would have predicted just how much of my time shifted from being science and innovation and tech reporter to really
right.
doing a lot of, like, energy policy and how the policy is gonna but, it matters. I mean, the
Mhm.
thing is, like, you talk about the geothermal technologies, for example, and the new technologies being innovated, and are they gonna get rolled out? Are they gonna get commercialized? Well, that depends on policy.
You've just validated the entire thesis for Wicked Problems and Why We Exist, so thank you for doing that. I feel like other people in your position who came from a science reporting background, like Akshat Rathi at Bloomberg, who has also found himself now having to cover things that he never thought he was going to cover before. But look, I wish you the best. We will make sure that we put links in the show notes where people can keep in touch with you and your reporting. Kat Clifford, senior reporter for Cipher News, thank you so much for joining us on Wicked Problems.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
On a morning from a Bogart movie, in a country where they turn back time, you go strolling through the crowd like Peter Lorre contemplating a crime. locks up your arm in hers, and you follow to your sense of which direction.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
To find what's waiting inside the ear of the cat.